Okay. Uh, Good morning or good evening, and welcome to the weekly webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. I'm Diane Sayre, filling in today for Harley Schlanger. And the topic today is global Glass-Steagall, not global NATO. And I think that already is very provocative, although some people may not appreciate how provocative it is. And what I would like to start with, Helga, is your response to the new national security study that was put out by the Trump White House. It's dated November 2025, but it really came out in the first week of December, which has some dramatic changes in it, really fundamental changes from previous Biden era policies and some other things that are not really changes in a different direction. But you put out a very thought out response. And rather than say more, let me turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. The new security strategy is, obviously a welcome break from what you said, the previous attitude represented in those papers before. It's a very mixed document. I think one has to look at it in its complexity. The European pro-NATO hardliners are in an absolute frantic state of mind reacting to it. Really unbelievable. I have not seen such a hysteria, probably never, at least not in respect to the United States. People like Norbert Röttgen and others, they say we have to basically get accustomed to the fact that the United States is no longer our ally. Unbelievable things. Naturally, I think important is that both Russia and China have careful but moderately positive reactions to it, not exuberant, because naturally everybody is aware of the fact that words are words and deeds are deeds, and everybody waits to see what will be the result. But I think there are some positive elements in it for sure. One is, in my view, the expansion of NATO is supposed to be stopped. The formulation is not 100% clear because it says the perception of a continuous expansion of NATO. That leaves naturally room between perception and reality. So with all caution, I think I would give it the credit of doubt. But, my response was obviously not to go now into every aspect of this very contradictory paper. It's terrible in respect to Latin America, where, they added the so-called Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine Trump did. Which basically means to take the Western Hemisphere as the backyard of the United States. It has, very mixed formulations in respect to China, and, carefully, worded improvements in the relationship to Russia, which is welcomed by the Kremlin spokesman Peskov. But rather than going into all the contradictions themselves, which, I think one can attribute them on the one side naturally to the very contradictory person of President Trump, but more fundamentally to the very contradictory situation the United States finds itself in, because on the one side, they want to keep world dominance. That's also very clearly expressed in the paper. But on the other side, is the United States really still in a position to keep up with that self-inflicted demand? So, but rather than responding to all of those things, I take a different approach and basically point to the fact that, given the fact that the old order, the neoliberal order, and especially the order which emerged in the post-Cold War period, where the United States and Great Britain tried to impose an unipolar world, which completely backfired because this went so much against the interest of the global majority of countries that now you have the emergence of a new system with the BRICS, the SCO, and obviously Europe is in a downward spiral, which is unprecedented. So actually you have the Middle East situation remaining, the Ukraine crisis not yet resolved. You have new crisis between Japan and China, and then you have the Venezuela invasion hanging over the world like a Damocles sword. So in light of all of these very complex problems, I took the approach to say that given the fact that there is now a process of transition, clearly, and that there are many actors pushing the world in different directions, why not take the approach to catapult the whole strategic discussion into a new domain, into a new paradigm, whereby one really tries to overcome all of these conflicts by abandoning geopolitics, by establishing a new paradigm where the one humanity is being put first, and then all the national interest must be brought into cohesion with the one humanity. And whoever says that's not possible has obviously no trust in the character of the human species, because we are one species and we have one future, because we are sitting all in one boat in the time of thermonuclear weapons and pandemics and the internet and various other factors. You know, anybody who does not see that our fate as one humanity is united for good or for bad is not thinking clearly. So therefore, I use the opportunity to say, let's use this moment of utmost insecurity and confusion and outrage and freak out to basically say, let's move to the discussion of a new security and development architecture, which in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia must take into account the interest of every single country on the planet, because if you don't do that, it does not lead to peace. And there are examples in history which can prove that. So I have issued this paper, and I would actually urge people, you know, we will attach the link under this webcast, and I would urge people not only to read it, but if you agree with that, endorse it with your name, circulate it as widely as you can among your, you know, friends and colleagues and social media network and other such institutions, because I think we have to get the discussion on a strategic level beyond the level of narrow self-interest, which then ends up in a array of contradictions for which no solution may be found. But if you redefine the whole discussion and say, let's start with the top is, where does mankind want to be in 100 years from now? And obviously, if we don't resolve our conflicts until then, we will not exist. So therefore, you know, I think that this is definitely something which should stir up minimum a discussion of how should mankind proceed to overcome the present many contradictions.
Now, there's a lot that we could look at, but one of the things you mentioned in your paper is the question of what happened in 1989. And I think it would be very useful for you to review your thoughts on that matter, because you and your late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, actually called for the reunification of Germany already in October of 1988. And then various forces, probably those who support NATO today, moved to imprison him and silence his voice. But a year later, the Berlin Wall was down. A year after that, Germany was reunified. And clearly that was a moment where a lot could have been changed. And you have said that you think that was a missed opportunity, and perhaps your clarification of that would help in this too.
Yes, as we have also documented in various interviews, among others with Jack Matlock, who was the American ambassador in Moscow in these fateful years, who testified that there was a golden opportunity, because already years before the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was not regarded as a threat anymore. And finally, when the wall came down and subsequently the Soviet Union disintegrated in 91, there was a moment where everything was possible. There was no enemy anymore. You had no, no obstacle to create a new security and development architecture. People were talking about a new security architecture from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Gorbachev and many others were talking about the common European house. And, there was the promise by Secretary of State Baker to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, that if you agree with the peaceful German unification, then we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Now, there has been a huge effort to basically say this was not true, this promise was never made, but that's not true, because in the meantime, literally hundreds of documents have been published, and anybody who wants to study the historic facts can go to the various presidential libraries, the National Archive, various other top libraries, and find the original documents. And there are hundreds of such statements that not only Baker made that promise, also the Foreign Minister Genscher at the time, and many others. That promise not to move NATO 1 inch to the east obviously was broken because, while Baker promised that, the neocons were already plotting, how to use the fact that they supposedly won the Cold War. They did not win the Cold War. I remember very well that Pope John Paul II at that time warned against any kind of triumphalism from the West by saying, there are structures of sin both in the East and the West. The structures of sin in the East were, paid by the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's my my comment. But the structures of sin, according to the Pope, were existing and visible in the underdevelopment of the countries of the developing sector. And he said, if you doubt that there are such structures of sin, look at the developing sector. So
I want to just interrupt for a second, because I think you and your husband also warned that the economic system of the West was going to collapse. So all of this gleeful celebration that communism has failed, and you said, well, that may be true, that was a failed system, but don't think that that means that the liberal free trade system also is a success.
worse collapse. And I think that, I don't want to take the glamour from my late husband, that he naturally was the person who prophetically anticipated all of that. But that particular statement is one of my claims to fame, because that's exactly where we are now. We are sitting on the hugest bubble in history ever. It's many times bigger than 2008. And, I think that's why we are calling for a global Glass-Steagall, because, I think also some of the Chinese economists, I think Lin Yifu, I forgot now exactly. He's a former IMF economic, chief economist of the IMF, and he warned that China should prepare for the eventuality of a potential collapse of the AI bubble. And I think that
Mm.
the present measures which are being considered, we could have a collapse triggered by foolishness, by indebtedness of firms, inability to pay, to keep certain payment schedules. For example, if the forces in the EU who are trying to steal the Russian assets which are in Brussels and in other European locations to, quote, finance the military aid to Ukraine, that act alone could trigger the meltdown of the entire system. And I think the Belgian Prime Minister De Wever is acutely aware of it, and that's why he is warning to absolutely not do that, because I think 117 billion or so are in Belgium, and he fears retaliation. But he said after the last discussion that Chancellor Merz from Germany is willing to guarantee the reaction, the fallout from such a system. Merz claims it's the entire EU, but that's not true. So Merz is actually gambling with the German taxpayer money. I mean, it's unbelievable what these people are doing in their despair. In any case, to come back to your question, it was visible at the time of the German unification, because it was clear that this money makes money system at the expense of the physical economy could not last forever. And that's where the big difference between the Chinese system, which has been betting a lot on physical economy, is in a much stronger position. And that's why they also won the recent trade war battle with President Trump. So we are in for very interesting times. But my point is, in proposing this security and development architecture, that once you agree to solve these problems together, you can solve any problem, because all these things are man-made. These are not natural catastrophes. So therefore, if there is a peaceful attitude, and you sit down and agree on certain principles, you can resolve these things. If you don't do that, there is the danger of an anarchistic collapse, which could bring havoc over the whole world.
No, I think this is very important, and I want to go back to the 1989 period, because many people who have not organized underestimate the intensity of the battle around economic policy. And around the time of the reunification of Germany, you had put forward several proposals for a kind of west to east economic development, which would have put us in a beautiful position today had that been done. And the leader of Deutsche Bank, Alfred Herrhausen, was assassinated. And I really think it would be good if you would say something about that. I understand there's a movie or a documentary in Germany that's been getting a lot of publicity and generating some discussion, but is it that important that these people would actually assassinate people in a position to make economic policy?
Well, I think that this is a question which has not yet been answered, because the idea that it was the third generation of the Red Army faction who killed Herrhausen is so dubious, and nobody believes it. Herrhausen was the head of Deutsche Bank, and he was a banker, unlike bankers today, because he was thinking of banking as a service to industry. He proposed, for example, the cancellation of most of the developing sector debt, because he said it's unpayable anyway, and as long as they're burdened with this debt, they cannot develop. That was a revolutionary proposal. He also proposed to develop Poland outside of the IMF framework by using the methods of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, which was used to create the German economic miracle in the post-war period. That also, violated obviously the standard of the international financial oligarchy. If you have a top banker proposing such things. So when he was assassinated, this was an absolute paradigm shift. And Fletcher Prouty, who was a Pentagon official, who actually in the movie by Oliver Stone about John F. Kennedy plays the Mr. X, he gave us EIR an interview at the time where he said that the significance of the assassination of Verhausen would be as paradigmatic like the Kennedy assassination for the United States. And I can only agree with that because at that point it was the question, what would happen with the German unification? And, Herrhausen was killed 2 days after Helmut Kohl had put out his 10-point program, which was the first baby step in respect to sovereignty made by Germany, It was not even a unification proposal, it was a proposal for a federated Germany, and even that was too much. So, after Herrhausen was assassinated, 2 days later, then there was an EU summit, and Kohl would later say that these were the darkest hours of his life because everybody came down on him, basically preventing him, from having any kind of idea what should happen with Germany. And what was imposed then on Germany was the euro as a way of controlling Germany, to make sure that there would be no independent relation between Germany and Russia, because, as has been stated many times, the German science and technology and the Russian raw materials and also manpower in terms of scientific manpower together would be a competitor for the United States unbeatable. So many experts have, in the meantime, and George Friedman being one of them who has famously said this, that since more than 100 years, it was the aim of the United States to prevent such a cooperation between an independent, sovereign Germany and Russia. So basically, the euro was designed to make sure that no such independent relationship would develop and that Germany would be firmly put in the corset of the EU, basically the austerity corset, which later was imposed with the debt brake. So, I think that this is an absolute tragic lost opportunity, because what we had proposed was to use the fact that now the Iron Curtain had vanished, and that you could unite the industrial and population centers of Europe with those of Asia through development corridors, meaning, that you could build not only transport lines, but not just, from A to B, but, have a unified approach for fast trains, highways, waterways, energy production, construction of communication centers, and that way create conditions for investments in the entire interior of the Eurasian continent, which would be equal to those to the seaside or riversides. And, that is what became the Eurasian, we called it the Eurasian Land Bridge, the new Silk Road in 91. And that is what you can see today, clearly what China has been doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. So, in a certain sense, it's on the one side good because these ideas did flourish. What is bad is that Europe took such a negative attitude to it that because of the rejection of cooperating with this new system, Europe is right now in a downfall without a bottom. And, while I'm not agreeing with every word in this new security doctrine, it has the formulation that if Europe does not change policy, it's threatened with a civilizational erasure, which is pretty strong language. Now, I think the paper refers to the influx of migrants as the cause of it. I think it is more fundamental that it's the wrong economic and cultural policy of Europe which is threatening such a potential civilizational erasure, which is a formulation I have used, but I attribute it to a slightly different cause or vastly different causes than this paper does. But the end effect is the same. Europe has to change policy if we are supposed to survive this present crisis.
I think that's a topic that has been on your mind for a very long time, as you've described, wondering how a nation, Germany, which produced Beethoven, Bach, Schiller, these geniuses, could have succumbed to National Socialism. And I think many people are reflecting on some pretty horrible shifts in their own nations. And I think your emphasis on this question of culture is really very important today. As an American, uh, I'll say I share your pain in a sense, because you see the intention of our republic to be a bulwark against colonialism, to say that every single human being is born with equal potential, and the purpose of government is to protect that. But then we seem to have a policy that is treating some people, to quote Animal Farm, as more equal than others. So some people are deemed better and acceptable, and other people are deemed to be, just thrown on the scrap heap. So we really have to get a shift. I think maybe I'll ask you a question that allows you to develop, because I think we should take some time on this positive vision that you have with your 10 principles that you've written for what type of architecture, what you're thinking in terms of how this would work. And I imagine it also involves agreements as Westphalia for debt forgiveness, perhaps returning to a fixed exchange rate, and so on, but fundamental principles. So the question that came in earlier is someone who said, there is a tendency among world leaders to find pragmatic solutions to solve a problem, which is a terrible tendency and will not change things for the better. I think we have to have a broad and people-to-people based discussion to find solutions which are based on a higher one, which will actually change things for the better and help to create a more perfect world. So that was a comment someone sent, but please go ahead on how we get to this new paradigm that you're talking about.
Well, I think the key question is man as a species, mankind, are we capable of giving us an order which allows our long-term survivability in the universe? And I think the key concept, I have in this 10 principles, I made 7 programmatic points, which are sort of obvious, like sovereignty, a new credit system, an infrastructure, a health system, various other such very concrete programmatic points. But I think the most important about it is the last 3 points, which are more of a philosophical nature, because unless you situate such an economic program in the context of a sort of relationship to the universe in which we are, it's sort of hanging in the air. And, that's why I, for example, say that we have to bring the political and economic order into cohesion with the physical laws of the universe. Now, I think that's eminently doable, because, the fact that human beings are capable of producing adequate ideas about the laws of the universe, which means that, mankind is able again and again to come up with, new discoveries, new hypotheses, which lead to scientific breakthroughs. And if you translate these breakthroughs into technologies, you can use them in the production process. And each time you do that, if it is an adequate idea, it leads to an increase in the productivity of the labor, productivity of the capacities, and consequently of an increase in the living standard of the people, the longevity increases, and so forth and so on. Now, the fact that an idea which comes from the human mind, and when somebody produces such an idea, it doesn't have material conditions, it doesn't have weight, it has no length, it's immaterial. Nevertheless, if it's an adequate idea, it has profound changes in the physical universe of the sort I just described, that it improves the conditions for mankind to live. That is the proof that there is a correspondence between the lawfulness in the microcosm, the mind, and the macrocosm, the physical universe, the economy, etc. Now that's a very important principle, because that means that that we are not just free floating in the universe, like accidental beings not connected to anything, but that we have a corresponding lawfulness which we have to, somehow obey. For example, the fact that we are now very close to produce on Earth plasma fusion processes which normally are taking place in the sun, and now in the form of fusion technology, we are very close of making that applicable as a production of fuel, which would limitless practically enable mankind to produce energy for tens of thousands of years to come. Now, if we can replicate something which is taking place in the sun in a fusion reactor on Earth, well, then you have the proof that such a correspondence exists, very practical. So if we can do it in terms of physical processes, then we should adjust our economic practice and our social practice and our cultural practice as well to these laws. And I think that is a very exciting idea, which has been celebrated also in great art, which is why my late husband always made the point that there is no difference in the mental activity which leads to scientific discovery and to artistic discovery. And that's why we have put so much emphasis on the need to have classical culture and not just some pop culture, because, while classical culture tries to discover such principles, pop culture just imitates rhythm, what also monkeys can do when they hammer against their cage. So there's a fundamental difference in that conception of art. Then naturally, and I just want to very briefly mention it, the image of man which goes along with that is naturally that I think we have to assume an image of man where we understand mankind of principally good by nature, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development. And the good news about that is, if it's a lack of development, it can be overcome by development. And if you apply that, then, and if you want to develop that capacity, there are no limits in the perfectibility of both the mind and the beauty of the character. Now, I know that most people scream when you say that, but I'm absolutely certain that the only worthwhile conception of man is one of the beautiful soul, and that it is potentially in every human being to become that. So that's my vision of this whole thing.
Well, that's great. And I would like to make a plug for the International Youth Conference coming up this Sunday, because I hope there are a lot of people watching this dialogue between us who say, well, I want to become a beautiful soul. I would like to take responsibility for the one humanity and leadership in my country. And that can be found on the Schiller Institute, I believe. So perhaps you would like to give people some marching orders. Let me just quickly add that we did have people yesterday up on Capitol Hill discussing the need to reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act and also nationalize the Federal Reserve. You cannot merely separate the banks and wipe out a lot of garbage without also having a national bank mechanism to direct credit into what's required. And I do think that part of this NATO operation is to maintain a financial system. The fact that they are purchasing weapons that can't even be produced for 3 years makes me think there must be some kind of giant derivatives bubble associated with this as well. I mean, that they are so desperate that the war between Ukraine and Russia can never end, etc. So I know you have several initiatives, and why don't you please go ahead and tell people what you want them to do, and any other thoughts or something that I forgot to ask you that you wanted to bring up.
Well, to mind come three things. One is naturally what you just raised. We have this idea of a global Glass-Steagall, which would mean that every nation should impose Glass-Steagall, have a national bank in every country, because that same requirement exists for each nation, and then have a clearing house between those national banks, which would then establish a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, emphatically with the idea of making financing of large infrastructure projects in the global south an absolute priority, because as Linda LaRouche always emphasized, the key difference between the new Bretton Woods and the old Bretton Woods is that the old Bretton Woods was established when, unfortunately, Roosevelt had died at an inconvenient moment, and Truman and Churchill eliminated the most important aim by Franklin D. Roosevelt, namely to uplift the condition of the developing sector. So that was not part of the Bretton Woods as it was, which was useful for the industrialized nations as long as it lasted until 71. But it did neglect the need to improve the living standard in the global south. So this would be a very important component. And obviously, if you have such a new security and development architecture discussion, that would be part of the agreement between, let's say, the Western nations and the BRICS countries to reorganize such a system. So please take this legislation. You can find them in a link which we will put under this webcast, and go to your elected officials wherever you are, congressmen, parliamentarians, various representatives, state legislators, mayors, and tell them that they should study the Glass-Steagall and the 4 laws of Linda LaRouche, because a time may come where you very quickly will have to enact these in the near future. Secondly, take my proposal for a new security and development architecture, and likewise approach professors, intellectuals, think tanks, various people, to say we need a discussion of how do we get out of this present strategic mess by moving into a completely new paradigm of international relations based essentially on the UN Charter, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And let's organize our world in a way where we all can live as one humanity. So that would be the second marching order. And if you are a youth, then you should definitely participate in our upcoming youth conference this next Sunday. So write to us and register and be part of it, because we want to have a discussion about the role of the youth. Because, in a certain sense, whatever we are saying is one thing, but the young people who are now in their teens and 20s and 30s, they have to either live or not. And, can you imagine, Chancellor Merz just had on this Monday a discussion in the public TV with so-called citizens, and then one soldier who said that he's a professional soldier since 10 years, he asks Merz a question, and he says, I have gotten used to the idea that I will only be 40 years old, then I will die because the present world situation. How would you, Chancellor Merz, convince young people that they have to die soon too? And then, and he meant it completely serious. He didn't say it, what the hell are you doing? He said, no, I'm used to it because I'm a soldier by profession. And then Merz naturally takes that huge flank which is given to him and says, no, I just want the army to be strong so that we never have to defend ourselves. But then basically the soldier comments and says, yeah. So it is awful. Can you imagine this? So, obviously the youth has to take a different role. And on the positive side, I can say that last Friday in Germany, you had about 50,000 pupils who took the streets in 90 cities to demonstrate against the draft. It's not that we are against the draft in general, which may be a patriotic thing you may want to do if it's for defensive purposes. But under present circumstances, it would really be to get young people as cannon fodder in the planned war, of which, for example, Prime Minister Orban of Hungary says the EU has made the decision already to go for this war. So under these circumstances, naturally, the pupils need all support to oppose that and make sure that this never becomes law. So therefore, if you are a young person, register for this conference. If you know a young person who should know about it, tell it to them. And then let's have this discussion of how the youth can play a role to fight for the new paradigm for all of humanity next Sunday and beyond.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and I look forward to speaking with you again very soon.
Okay, till soon.